I've completed this painting of Gregory in a day. It's taken nearly 5 hours to reach this stage. If you continue watching, we're going to take you back to the beginning, explain the process of how it's been done. Firstly, I stained this canvas a mid-brown with some burnt sienna. I sketched Gregory from life with charcoal. That was then taken into some monochrome underpainting, just using brown and white, actually a tiny bit of orange as well, and then bringing more colours in the final stage. So it went from drawing through to underpainting to overpainting to reach this stage. And if you keep watching, I'll explain the whole process for you. So I'm just going to start by looking at the head in two main shapes. So to start with, I'm just going to draw a big circle which represents the skull, and that now is the width of Greg's head as I look at him. So I've established the scale, and what I'm going to do is now add the jaw to this circle. So the circle is from the top of the head and actually goes down to the mouth. Because see what I'm doing? I'm taking the measurement with my brush handle here across the head. I'm bringing my thumb to one side and the end of the handle to the other side. That is the width of Greg's head as I see him from here. So if I now turn 90 degrees with my brush handle, the same measurement goes from basically the hairline down to the mouth. So that's where the hairline is. So I've actually got to allow more. Actually, I've got to allow more space for the hair. Do you know what I'm going to have to do? I'm going to have to bring that circle down a little bit, because compositionally, I want to get the hair on the canvas panel here. So I'm just moving that all down now. And this is the best time to work out everything and change everything, get it right. So now that brings the mouth down to here, and that gives me space for hair over here. And the next thing I'm going to do is work out the proportion I've got to add to that measurement to get down to the chin. So I'm just literally counting the spaces and comparing. So if I take this circle down to the mouth, I have to add about a third again to get down to the bottom of the chin. So so I'm pretty much painting the head over life size here. So we're getting a head that's approximately this size. And in fact, we can establish this. If I lean forward and take an actual measurement next to the head, I'm actually going about 10% bigger than life. But you can draw the head at any scale you like, but the smaller it goes, the more tricky it gets. So actually painting slightly bigger than life makes it a little bit easier to...
Where's his chin?
So this is where I've marked the chin. So I've got the circle here, and I'm adding the chin coming down to here. I haven't really drawn the shape yet. I'll explain as I go how I'm going to divide this up. So instead of drawing an oval, some people always start a portrait with an oval, and then they make a face out of it. Well, I've drawn a circle plus the chin, because it will give us better measurements as we go through the process. So what I've got to do now is work out where the eyes are and where the features are lining up on the face. I'm drawing a 3/4 portrait from this position. Some of you will be drawing a full face, looking straight on, and I think Judy's going to be drawing nearly a profile from there. Is that right? So we're all going a slightly different angle. So now I'm measuring from the top of the head down to the eye level, and the eyes, if I include the top of the skull, are actually exactly halfway. If I go just down from the hairline, the eyes are slightly above halfway. So half is there. So you can work out where half is. So the eye level is actually just slightly above that from my position. So this is a line going from the corner of one eye to the corner of the other. And at this position, Greg's head is pretty much on a level. If I asked him to tilt his head, obviously this line would tilt with him. So let's keep it simple. And so that's the eye level. Hair is going to go right up here. So it's going to create a nice diagonal composition. Ear, the top of the ear is level with the eye level. I'll come back to that and I think position that a bit more carefully in a minute. But the next thing is I need to work out the alignment of the features. So I'm not actually drawing any particular shapes at this stage. I'm going to work out where the point between the eyes is, the bridge of the nose. And so I'm measuring from the outside of Greg's head to that middle point. And then I'm counting across the head. So 2, 3, 4. And in fact, it's pretty much the width of an eye from where I'm looking at it. So I've actually got 5.
You've actually turned your head slightly that way. Can you? That's better.
That's perfect. Yes. Now I've got the alignment. So we've got basically the head from my angle divides into about 5 eyes width overall. If you actually measure the one eye and count it into the rest of the head, you get about 5 eyes. So I'm just getting the middle of the nose, though, comes in at about 1/4 of that distance. So if that's my overall width, halfway there, the middle of the nose, I'm getting literally at 1/4. So it's literally a 3/4 profile. So now I can work out from there where the middle of the mouth is, down here. And because Greg's head is vertical and not tilting, I can connect a line from the middle of the nose to the middle of the mouth. And I've got this, what looks like a T. And I'm also now looking at how far the eyes come across the head. And the answer is they come just past halfway. So I know where the eyes are, I know where the mouth is, I know where the centre of the mouth is. And so if you now look at the marks on my sketch, I could probably rub away a few of the old marks, and you will get an idea of the shape of the head. And now I'm just putting in the shape of the jaw. I can mark off how far the nose comes down to the mouth. And this is all just simple measurements at the moment, but I've pretty much got the basis to start drawing a portrait. And before I do that, I'm just going to look at a few other parts of the features. So, for example, the eyebrows. A common mistake in portraiture is to get the eyebrows too close to the eyes. So I'm just looking at the height of the eyebrows above the eyes. Not really worrying so much about the shape. I'm looking at where the hairline comes across the top of the forehead and the shape of the hair towards the temples and down in front of the ears. So I'm starting to draw the sort of shape of the hair and the head as a whole. And also another distinctive feature that varies hugely between subjects is the shape of a forehead. And a lot of people don't really look at the shapes of the forehead, the cheeks, so on. They just look at the overall head and think they can get a likeness. But actually, what you really need to make sure of before you start getting any likeness in terms of the shapes of the eyes, etc., is look at the shapes of all the areas in between the features. So, forehead, cheek. So I'm just looking here at the shape of the cheek. The upper lip shape, the upper mouth shape. The chin itself. And again, where the centre of the chin lines up with the centre of the nose and the centre of the mouth, so that we start to get an overall plan. I can even put in the shape of Greg's beard now, a little bit, and I can put in the shape of the nose. I'm not doing this in perfect detail yet. I'm really still plotting, but roughly getting the proportions in place. and so on. So I'm looking at where the nostrils come and where the bridge of the nose comes and so on. And then we've got to look carefully at the overall size and shape of the eyes. Actually, I'm not getting the slope of that forehead back far enough. That slopes back a bit more. So if you're sort of keeping, you're probably going actually ahead of me, you guys, some of you, but if you're keeping pace, you should have all the features roughly plotted. But don't rush ahead. If you haven't got to that stage yet, just take care to plan the positioning of everything in the face before you start drawing these shapes. So I'm now looking at the shape of an eye, having plotted where the corner of the eye starts and the outer corner finishes. So again, remember I checked this all in proportion to the rest of the head. That's really quite critical, because if you get the eyes either too spread too far or not far enough, it will completely alter the appearance. So before you draw the shape of the eyes, make sure you position them carefully. And the shape of an eye is sort of like an almond. Or is it a parallelogram? If you start off with a parallelogram, like I'm just doing, you'll notice that I'm getting the top eyelid highest at a point closer to the nose, and the bottom eyelid lowest at a point further away. So, and then you just curve them off gently. You also have to allow space when we get into more detail for the eyelids themselves, so that you include the folds of the eyelid, etc. So I'm even positioning the iris now in the eye, and you'll notice what I'm actually drawing. It's not quite a circle. When you're doing a 3/4 view and Greg's not looking at me, he's looking past me, you're not drawing a circle. You're actually drawing something slightly like an ellipse, but you don't see the top of this. That's hidden by the eyelid itself. You see, in fact, even the bottom of the iris is hidden by the lower eyelid in this instance. So you don't actually get to draw a complete circle or even a complete ellipse for the iris. You have to draw a part of that. Now I'm just matching here. Again, when you draw two eyes, I've noticed sometimes with students they tend to sort of draw two perfectly symmetrical eyes, and it's something to look out for, because especially if you're drawing from an angle, the eyes are not symmetrical. So for instance, the bottom eyelid on Greg's far eye, as I look at him, has a much fuller curve on the outside edge, because it's going around the cheek here. The top eyelid comes down. It doesn't quite seem to meet it. I actually lose that far corner because it's going round the side of Greg's face. So I've got pretty much everything in position now. And I'm going to use any other folds, for instance, just by the side of the cheek here, any other shapes, sometimes just soft shadows, just to make sure everything is falling into the correct position. And I've sort of got everything plotted in the head. I'm going to draw the neck with the scarf coming around it, shape of the shoulders, and I'm looking at where the collar actually doesn't come up as high as I'm getting it here. The neck comes down, the collar comes lower than the chin. If I get the slope on the shoulder. Let's get the shape of the hair right. And I'm just going to check I've got the width across the cheek here. I think I've got too much space before the ear starts at the moment. I haven't looked at that carefully enough, so I'm going to compare that space from the eye to the ear, and it should relate as the distance from one eye to the other here, the whole width. Yeah, so I've got to bring the ear into here. I just was a 1/4 of an inch out, maybe. So with charcoal, if anybody's using charcoal, I'm just going to grab a different brush. If you've got a hog brush, just a very stiff brush, you can now tidy up your sketch, take away some of the planning lines, like this. A damp cloth also works very well for this stage when you just want to tidy things up. So I'm just going to use a rag with a little bit of water on, and I can just clean up a bit more from my charcoal. If you are or want to try using charcoal, I know some artists say they get a bit messy in the paint later on, but if you, one, do a little bit of cleaning up at this stage, and two, I'm going to be painting in acrylics. Start off with a thin layer of acrylics. You'll find that once that first layer has dried, which is not going to take long, you can then it will absorb all the charcoal, and the stage after that you'll be able to get your colours really bright and clean. So in the first stage this might look like the colours are losing a little bit of clarity, but hopefully thereafter it won't be a problem. So I'm going to start at this stage by using diluted burnt umber, just a little bit of water in it to basically go over my charcoal and refine the drawing, make any adjustments as necessary to the composition, but starting with the shadows. And I'm working on a coloured ground, which was a white canvas that I've actually stained with burnt sienna, which is another a middle brown shade, and I've just wiped it over with a damp sponge to create a half tone, if you like, which is the traditional way of painting, either in acrylics or before that in oils. And just by diluting this paint more, I can get more tonal variations, so for more delicate shadows and so on. So I don't have to put any white in at this stage. I will use white for the highlights in a minute, but to start with I'm just using shades of burnt umber. I'm only using a filbert hog brush here, which doesn't give me any precision in terms of detail, because I shall be blocking in the main shapes with this brush before I work into any detail. This is also a stage where if you start looking at the lights and the shadows in your sketch, you'll probably pick up any areas which aren't correct. You'll find, oh, you've got too much space between the eye and the ear, for example, or too little. So you can correct those things as you underpaint. It's called this first layer. So as I paint, I'm not just painting over the charcoal. I am checking my proportions, checking my shapes. And one advantage of painting in this manner, so first sketching very loosely, then underpainting, is you can work in a way which is fairly loose. You'll notice that what I'm my whole method is a fairly expressive technique. I'm able to hold my brush, for example, right at the end, rather than I'm not going in tiny details like this. I'm just holding my brush. I'm trying to get the character, if you like, into the portrait, and find shapes that present themselves which will hopefully add to the sort of dynamic quality of the portrait. So, for example, the way the scarf and the collar relate to the face and the head. So here I go. I'm just going to refine the shapes here, and I'm probably at the stage where I can start using some paler shades. So I'm going to be putting a bit of white into the umber. I think actually because of Greg's complexion, I'm just going to grab another tube of colour. I've got some cadmium orange here. So as I go paler, rather than just white, I'm going to keep it warm by adding a little bit of orange into my paler mixture, which gives me a sort of a paler, softer brown. Here we go. So I could start picking up where the light is picking up on the face now. And I can also, with these paler shades, I can remodel where the darker strokes are perhaps a little bit inaccurate. Here's an eyebrow, and I'm going to bring this colour underneath it and above it. So I start to reshape and refine with this next shade. I can do the same around the eye isn't defined here, so I'm going to use the shape of the flesh above the eye with this lighter colour. Just using the tip of the brush carefully. And I'm going to take another brush and with my burnt umber on it, and I combine the light shade on the one brush and a dark shade on the other. I can push the shape of the eye into a more accurate configuration. So we've got highlights in here, the shape of I haven't done much to the shape of the mouth yet, or the shape of the tip of the nose, so I'm going to model them. And pretty much everything I'm doing now is still dependent on those first marks I used to capture the proportions. So if you are having any problems in a portrait at this stage, in terms of you think, oh, the likeness is just not happening, go back to those proportions, recheck those first measurements, the position of the eyes, the shape and size of the features, as well as the areas in between forehead, cheeks and so on. It's really important to get these overall proportions accurate, and then you'll find that the actual features, once you start drawing them, such as the eyes, nose and mouth, if you've got them in the right place, it will make a huge difference. If you don't get them in the right place, you may end up spending a lot of time drawing a perfect eye and then having to move it, which is very annoying, obviously. So keep checking your proportions are right from the beginning. I'm now going back into my dark brush to try and plot where the lips come together. And remember, in the 3/4 angle like this, the middle of the mouth is going to be 3/4 of the way across the mouth. Just seen a little touch there on the eyebrow. Well, from my 3/4 angle, but you're drawing from a well, probably a 7/8 angle. You can just see one edge of the face. So as you plot it, and look at how much of the mouth you can see. You can't, or where the middle of the mouth is. It won't be in the middle as you see it. It will be at the edge, further to the edge. So for you, the middle of the mouth is far across to the right. I'm looking at Greg from another angle. I'm now going to take a synthetic brush, a big, it's actually a 3/4 inch brush, because with this synthetic brush I can start to put in with the edge of it some more precise marks. So I'm working down in size from the larger brushes towards these the smaller brushes, but as well as that I'm also changing from hog brushes to synthetic brushes where I need more precision. But I'm going to go back to my hogs for getting the shapes of the shadows. So using brushes that you feel comfortable with is very important in this process. Using the right type of brush, but obviously again that depends on your technique. If you've got a very sharp, precise style, you may find yourself using more either sable or synthetic brushes, whereas if you're painting in a more impressionistic style, you'll probably be using soft hog brushes like I'm using to start with here. So let's start plotting the light. So there's more light just on the bridge of Greg's nose here. There's more light on the top of his cheekbone here. There's more light on the forehead, higher up here, and also at the edge of the forehead. Just underneath the eye on this cheek too. And just by varying the amount of white relative, I'm not diluting the paint by the way at this stage, I'm using it pretty much undiluted, occasionally just cleaning the brush and wiping it, but I'm not, I started with watery paint, I'm now using acrylic paint as it comes, and to get the different shades I'm just mixing between the burnt umber, a bit of cadmium orange and white, so I'm getting the variety of shades through the proportions of those colours. I'm not using the full colour palette yet, I will, but remember I'm still effectively underpainting, and I can use the ground colour in some areas for the half tones. Notice how as the light comes down the forehead here, there's a soft shadow that seems to almost connect the eyebrows, and then the light picks up again on the bridge of the nose here. Ears, by the way, are fascinating, and you probably know that an ear is unique. Everybody's ears are different, so you've got to look carefully at the ear and see the way the folds relate to each other. It always inspires confidence when you see a portrait with a well-painted ear. Again, I'm just using lights and darks to plot the ear. And now I'm actually taking some white, as for me where Greg is sitting, the wall behind is white, so actually it's not quite white I'm painting here, but I'm just going to use this white now to go around the edges of the head. And it just starts to give me, when I put some contrast in like this, you start to get a sense of the way you can exploit the light over the whole painting to create a drama. And I quite like the idea of having Greg in the sort of quarter tones, half tones and so on, but against a bright background. So I can use this as a way of emphasizing the head against the light. And I can do the same on this side. So if you've got to this stage, this is a point where you can use the background itself as a way of refining the shapes and so on you've already plotted for the head. So I'm now getting the shape of Greg's cheek here carefully described by using the white wool behind. And with acrylic paints, of course, you can go in very quickly, just let the layer of paint dry in a minute or two, and then you can put another layer on top, and you can heighten, brighten, and intensify these effects very rapidly. Right, time to grab a smaller brush, and I'm going to start working into the features of the eyes. I think actually I'm going to get my palette laid out now with the rest of the colours. Right, I've just laid out a palette with more colour on it this time. So I have got some cadmium red, some ultramarine blue, still got some cadmium orange in my burnt umber. I've also got yellow ochre, white, plenty of white still, and I've also got a colder blue. This is actually a cobalt turquoise, but you could use cerulean blue, only because of the colour of the scarf here. It needs this cooler shade of blue. I might use a little bit in the complexion, and what might be surprising to many is that even with a deep, warm complexion, there are going to be bits of blue which I shall blend into these colours in due course. There'll be bits of blue. Ultramarine is the safest blue to use for this. And although Greg's complexion is predominantly warm in colours, there will be cooler areas where the colour's slightly grey. It's very subtle. I'll describe that as we do it. So what I need to do now is get the shapes of the eyes and the mouth. So I've got a few
look at some
small brushes.
Stuff and can't see it. Do you want to blob a bit somewhere?
Just a blob.
On here.
Here I go. I'm using a round brush for the first time.
Oh, it's watercolour. It's yours.
Sorry?
Do you charge for giving me
And for getting the eyes, the white of the eye as such is not white. It's actually a little bit of a fleshy grey colour. So what I mean by that is I'm using a mixture here of ultramarine, white, and a little bit of the paler shade I was using earlier with the cadmium orange in it. So I'm adding white and blue to that to get a grey colour, which is, I don't know if it shows up, but it's really a warm bluey grey, not a cold bluey grey. And when you start looking at the eyes, draw the shapes, try to appreciate how much of the eye, between the eyelids, is occupied by the iris, and how much of the whites, so-called whites of the eye you see. And the answer to that is you don't draw too much white, is what I'm getting at. It's only a small proportion of the whole. And the other feature that is important to remember, as I described when drawing the shapes of the eye to start with, the iris itself is part of an ellipse at this angle, or part of a circle if you're looking straight on. But remember that we don't see the whole of that ellipse or the whole of that circle because of the folds of the eyelids themselves. One thing I'm conscious of doing here is to make sure that as I paint in both eyes, that they relate to each other correctly. So the space between the eyes is a key factor. So from one tear duct to the other, and you get approximately the width of an eye between the eyes. So as I take the width of the nearest eye to me, and move it across, it will give me the space to the next. So I've already noticed, interestingly, so this is an area where I've just got to move, because I hadn't defined it enough, I've actually put this corner too far across. The corner of the left eye as I look at Greg. So I'm going to just move that in a bit. Put this space right. Another millimetre. Which means I can then move the iris across a bit.
His eyes are beautiful.
Very
Yeah.
beautiful, isn't
Thank you. Well, I think you're right then. I think actually beauty is a word you could have to use on both men and female, and a lot of
Yes.
the time people think it's reserved for
Women.
women.
Yes.
But I think you can use it, have male beauty as much as female beauty. You know, people use the word handsome instead, don't they?
They do.
But, you know.
I'm always fascinated, especially with children, what quality they have in their eyes and their smiles.
Mm-hmm. I'll go in with my white again. Once I just moved this eye in by, I don't know, about 5 millimetres, I'm moving the cheek in by the same amount. Just sort of slightly, use a little bit of water on my brush to get a smooth line here. So I'm moving the cheek in by a similar amount.
And children's characters as well, I love.
Finding the character as you paint a portrait is really, that's the sort of icing on the cake if you can manage it.
Yes.
It's such an elusive quality, isn't it?
Yes.
And the difference between, just a slight smile and a sinister grin is not a lot. You have to look very carefully. I think now I've got just checking my proportions again. I keep checking these proportions because it's amazing how easy it is to lose the drawing as you build up the paint. So this is why I use charcoal, because you can manipulate the charcoal with the paint when you get to this stage, and you can move things around a bit still, as I've just done with that eye. And you can constantly refine your painting as you evolve from the underpainting stage even through to the colour stage, which is I'm about to do. I'm just getting those eyes in. I'm going to do the mouth in a minute. I'm also just moving the bridge of the nose a tiny bit closer to the corner of the eye here. Going back to my paler orange mix. So now I can get the shape of the mouth. This is where I'm going to start introducing a little bit of colour. I'm adding to my orangey flesh mix a tiny bit of cadmium red. And I'm looking at the bottom lip. And when somebody's just relaxing, and their mouth is relaxed, you get the shape of a sort of flattened M. It's a very flat M shape. So the mouth tends to turn down into the outer corners of the mouth. And we've got this flattened M. Now I'm going to get the slightly deeper shade. This is The same orangey mix with a little bit more red and the burnt umber in it will give me this deeper shade. So I can now start producing the shadows around the lips. And the upper lip itself, which is darker than the bottom lip because it doesn't catch the same amount of light. And then it goes dark again as the lips meet. Mouths, the problem a lot of artists have with mouths is they try to sort of draw an outline around the lips. And that's a mistake. And if you look carefully, you'll see that the bottom lip will throw a bit of a shadow underneath it, between itself and the chin. But that shadow softens towards the outer corners of the mouth. So I'm just literally putting a paler shade in at each side here. So the lips aren't outlined, if you follow me. And by using a nice brown brush with a good tip on it, I can go back into my burnt umber. I'm actually adding a little bit of red to it and a little bit of ultramarine blue. And you get a sort of purpley brown, which I can go back into the mouth itself, where the lips meet, and give a really nice deep shadow. So it's burnt umber with a little bit of red and blue. And just mixing it on the palette, it gives a nice dark shadow line. You can also use this same colour, sort of purpley brown colour, to draw the shadows on the edges of the eyelids, to draw the shadows that fall into the eyes themselves, or on the edge of the iris. It goes much darker. I'm not putting any reflections on the eyes until the end because I'm looking carefully at the different shades of brown in Greg's eyes. And so having started with the burnt umber itself, when I just plotted the eyes, in the iris, there's a little bit of light. I don't know if it will pick up on camera, but there's a little bit of light refracting from the eye. It's light that's entering the eye from higher, and it's refracting and reflecting back out of the eye, illuminating the iris with a little bit of colour. It's very subtle. And the pupils themselves are very dark, so I'm mixing burnt umber with ultramarine, putting in the darks there, and there's also a very dark shadow literally at the top of the iris where the eyelid itself is throwing a shadow into the eye, so it is very dark at the top part of the iris. I haven't yet described the eyelids properly, so I'm going back to a paler mixture here with my cadmium orange, a little bit of yellow ochre this time and white, and I'm picking out where the light is catching the eyelid here. And it's not a very accurate shape just painting in like this because again you're going to be building up layers of paint which will clarify the shape. So although this is where the light's catching the upper lid, I will still be drawing back with the darker fold above it and and refining it a little bit more carefully. So don't worry if you find it too tricky to capture the detail of these shapes to start with. But the brush I'm using is a synthetic brush which gives a nice tip on it, and is enabling me to get a degree of accuracy even though it's not as sharp as I would like it at this stage.
Listen, you have to open that. Like, you just push it in. Oh, brilliant. Thank you.
As I work into the eyes now, I'm looking at the different ways that the light is catching the eyelids. So, for example, First shape, the easy one to do is just get the shape of the shadow on the upper eyelid. So I'm not painting eyelashes, it's where the eyelashes are. And it produces a nice dark, continuous dark line right through to from the tear ducts to the outer corners of the eye. You can use the same dark for the bottom eyelids, but be a bit more sparing here because the bottom eyelashes are much more sparse, if you like, than the upper eyelashes, so you don't need to go in too heavily. And bit by bit, the eyes start to appear. In order to get myself in a position to draw accurate sweeping lines, I'm using my little finger as a rest here. So I'm leaning on my little finger with my hand, and then I can swing the brush through the arcing shape of the eyelid. You actually see the eyelashes just catching above the light at the edge of the face here. I'm going to just go back around with the light on the cheek here.
Get terrible cramp in my hands. It's like my hands are really, really concentrating. And then they give up.
Just now starting to pick up on all the sort of, just getting back over all the areas of the head now. I will come back to the eyes to refine them, but I'm just going through all the cheeks and the forehead, and so I'm looking at how the light is catching different areas of the face to try and model it even more accurately. And at this stage I'm bringing in hints more colour, so I'm not putting a lot of colour in, but little bits of red into this basically orangey brown mixture I'm starting with, little bits of yellow ochre, and I'm adding white, and it's just giving me variations on the same shades, variations that just emphasise the folds and the flesh of the modelling of a cheek. Picking out the light on the cheekbones. And I find that in acrylics in particular, perhaps a little bit more than oils, is the colours don't seem to hold their brilliance quite as they dry. They just lose a tiny bit of brilliance. So I tend to slightly overemphasise rather than the opposite way. So I'm just picking up, exaggerating a little bit, because I think as the paint layers dry into each other, they will mellow a little bit. With oils, you can mix up a load of different shades and they'll stay sticky all day long. But with acrylics, I tend to be remixing the colours continuously to keep them sticky. I don't use a stay wet palette because I don't like the colours get a little bit thin in the stay wet palette. I prefer to keep the paint thicker, but keep adding to the mix. And if you keep keep the palette itself simple, it's easier to repeat and remix colours as you run out of those colours. Going back into the brush I started with now. Going back into the burnt umber to paint in more of the beard. The neck and the shape of the throat just onto the beard as well. got to refine the moustache. You see here, there's a little bit of flesh between the moustache and the lips. Again, a smaller brush. And if you keep, I've got the medium grain canvas here, and if you paint with a dryish mixture, you can get a bit of extra texture, which helps when you're painting hair, because it will just catch the texture of the canvas, will just catch the colours off the brush. That will give you what are called scumble strokes, in other words, slightly broken paint, where the colours from beneath show through. Using that now by using a very dry mixture, just flicking it over the top of the surface of the canvas, and you can get the areas where the hair is very softly, or where you can see through. For example, where the beard is thinner, where it's more closely shaved, you'll see the flesh through the beard. It's not solid, so you can paint the flesh, and then you can scumble the beard on top of that with a dry brush. It's just getting used to the surface. If the brush is too wet, it will fill in. I think I've just done it a bit too wet. So you may have to go over these areas a couple of times. I'm going to go back with my lighter mixture now into the dark, again scumbling back into it. It's broken colour, which hopefully will give a less dense look and keep the surface, or the texture of the surface, will just keep enough paint on it to suggest the thinner areas of the beard. Again, using the first brush I started with to go back and pick out a little bit more the features of the ears in this instance. You find that if you had spent an hour painting an ear at the early stage of painting and then found you've not got it in the perfect position, it would be a little bit frustrating. So I don't, I just hint at the ear, I pick out the lights and darks, but now I can go back to it, I can then develop it a bit more. So I'm continuously building up the painting right across the whole surface rather than just in one area at a time. I've now got my big hog brush, so I'm going to go back around the outside again and just redefine the edges. Then I can come down like I did on the other side and sharpen up the shape of the ear. A little bit more. My painting on the left, then just making it brighter. Again, we've got the edge of the hair against the background here. I don't want to block it out completely, so I'm I'm not putting any pressure into the brush. I'm just stroking it and lifting the brush off so that I sweep across, and that way I can suggest the light coming through the hair, the top of the head here, just breaking the strokes up. Now I'm going to get another brush just with the burnt umber on it, adding a little bit of ultramarine, and I can flick it into that paint and start to get a hairy texture with the flicks. Dry painting, essentially. Quite a bit of blue going into this brown, which makes a very dark shade, where the hair is tightly pulled together. And then I add more brown and even some orange and red into it where the light's catching the hair. Now starting to go around again, so this is just underneath the ear, just to get the shape of the chin right, and then I can come in with my turquoisey blue. I'm going to actually mix a bit of flesh colour into it because it's a grey blue, so just mixing warmer shades of flesh, a little bit of red, and then I can get a cooler grey down here, which is going to set off perfectly the warm palette of all the flesh colours. Just wetting my brush very, very slightly here, just to give a more flow to the paint. So as opposed to the scumble strokes I was using in the hair, the wetter strokes can now follow the folds of the cloth and create a sharper shape. And I'm adding my ultramarine and brown mixture into this blue now to put the folds into it. This is just a sort of grey-blue mixture. The folds of the cloth, the twists of the cloth.
Oh, got cramp in my hand. I've got this thing where if it gets cold, all my fingers go numb, and it's, I don't know what it is. I know a number of people who've got it. There's nothing I can do about it. And when I'm shopping, I can't get stuff out of my pockets because my fingers become completely useless. Yes.
Again, just using the colours to offset the rest. Now I'm going to go back into my dark palette to put in some shoulders. So this is just brown and blue, which will give me the deepest shade of the fleece here. I'm going to add white to this mixture in a second. Pick up the light on the cloth. Just going with the darkest areas. Just putting a thin coat of this in, but what I'm going to try and do is then pick up the edges by adding bits of white. So we get
My hand under a lot.
some charcoal grey colour. Again, I'm using this big flat brush to pick up on the cloth to give the edges the sharpness I need. The other thing about a big flat brush like this is you can cover a lot of the canvas very quickly. So it's an advantage where you're trying to get an even colouring over a large area. But the other thing I can do with big flat brushes, I can add a little bit of white to this, and I can just, with the edge of it, suggest the zip.
I haven't got any white too.
Oh, I've already given you some. You've got some there. Look.
Oh, there. Stupid of me.
Again, I'm using my white to come back into the edges of the painting to refine the initial drawing, clarify the shapes, take out any areas where the painter's strayed out of position. In a stylistic sense, I do like to pick out areas of a portrait with as much clarity as possible, but still keep the brushwork as a whole as loose as possible. And it's a sort of trying to keep the balance between, you know, a very quick, lively sketch and an accurate study. And when artists like Whistler would have 100 sittings of several hours each and get nowhere, which is recorded in some detail. If you want to Google that Whistler and find out about his techniques, he used to cause constant anguish to his clients when they had been posing for hours and hours, only to find the canvas had been wiped back to a bare canvas several times over. But then this technique is trying to capture something of the spontaneity of a quick study, but still hopefully offer enough accuracy to bring out the character. Again, just going back and accurately drawing the edge of the ear with white background, using the negative shape to help refine the positive shapes. Negative spaces, in other words. And now go back through the areas as a whole, refining with the middle tones. We need some pepper orange, I've run out. And then I'm going to go back and look at the eyes, and there's going to be features like the reflections in the eyes. I'm going to get the lids right. I've also got to get the tip of the nose looking a bit better. But we're starting at this stage to get the painting into something like a recognisable study. I'm too far over to the edge of the neck here. Just doing, I'm going to go back with my light. Okay, push that in. Neck. Now it's time to just provide another layer of the flesh colour, see if I can get the balance across the cheeks with a bit better model, a little bit raw here still, so I'm just going to look at the colours in multiple sheets. Just grab a bit more burnt umber. You'll notice I don't, in this technique, do much blending. What I tend to do is just keep mapping the colours in a and as I map them, so in other words, I'm painting one little section at a time, but once I've done this section, if I can see the same colour with the same tonal value and another part of the portrait, as I've got it mixed, I will then jump to that other, so from this cheek to that cheek, for example. The softening where the shadow fold of the cheek comes in down here, much softer than what happens is actually often in my paintings, because I block it in so severely at the outset, and I put about 10 years on my subjects, then hopefully as I build up the layers of paint, those years come back again when we get to something more like the correct age. But the other thing that's creeping into these colours every so often, for instance, the shadows under this cheek, I've got a little bit of blue in them. Not much, but just enough to give the correct tonal range, the correct shade to the flesh. You don't see blue as such, but wherever the colours aren't quite as vibrant or as warm, that's where the blue plays its part. Looking at things like the nose and trying to model it. Noses are surprisingly tricky to paint because unless you're drawing a profile where you've got an outline for the nose, the shape of the nose is only revealed when you've got all the correct lights and shadows in place. So for example, there's some soft shadows at the edges of the nostrils here. They're not dark lines. When I started sketching, I put in dark lines, but at this stage, I put in a dark line like this. I've got to soften it. So you're spending a lot of time just literally getting the edge of the shadow, and then you're trying to soften that shadow into the folds and into the rest of that feature. So you have to model those lights and shadows very accurately. It's not, I won't pretend it's easy, and a lot of people think, oh, a nose, not too tricky, but you've got to look carefully, and you can't overdo it. You don't want a heavy line on one side of the nose. You're just going to look at the difference in light and shadow across the nose. The same into the side of the nose here, the bridge of the nose. It's the way the shape of the shadow is fall into this area, which goes deeper and deeper. Both sides of the bridge of the nose. Then you've got the space between the eyebrow and the eyelids here, and how much light do you get into that area? And the answer, it just depends on how the light's falling, obviously. I'm going back to my first orangey flesh mixture, and I'm using a flat brush here just to sort of pick out where the light is just catching some of that flesh. Not quite as bright as on the eyelids beneath, but it's they're still catching the light. Eyelids gain more light here. Sometimes just the corner of a square brush is a good way to get into these little details without having to swap to a tiny brush. I need to get my round brush with a good tip on it now to get the upper eyelids firstly a bit more accurate. So I've hinted at them, but now I'm going to go back and just refine the shape a little bit more. On both sides. I'm going to look at the way the iris connects with the bottom lid. And as you look at the bottom lid, the eyelids are relatively thick. The flesh of an eyelid is, several millimeters deep. So the bottom eyelids will catch the light. And that's they'll catch the light on the edge of the eyelid, but above where the lower eyelashes are. But but this way they catch the light isn't the same all the way along the lid. So you have to actually change that highlight as you go into the corners of the eyes. It might be lighter in the middle and not so light elsewhere. And I'm looking at all the little folds within the flesh around the eyelids. So the overall process of this painting is started with all the basic shapes, mapping and plotting, measuring and planning. But at this stage, once you're really happy all of those areas have been resolved, you can now start looking at the finest details and modelling a little bit more carefully. And I'm not using a small brush for this, I'm using actually a number 8 round brush. And if I wasn't painting this to explain to everybody how I'm doing it, if I was just painting on my own with my sitter with grey hair, I would probably be having a conversation with him.
It's fine.
And we would, you'll find that if you actually relax your sitter and let them talk, let them answer you and so on, you'll get a more natural expression coming across the features. So don't feel you've got to have your sitter there in absolute silence. You'll find a more animated face will often produce a better portrait anyway. I'm looking at the little bits of light that are now reflecting in the iris here into light. Looking at the way the cheekbone comes around the side of this far eye. You can actually see the top of the cheek curving all the way around beyond the edge of the eye. Just going to clean my brush and make sure I can keep the flesh colour here catching the light. Just doing a little bit grey, so I've cleaned the brush, dried the brush, rechecked the colour on my palette, and I can go back in and put in a cleaner colour now. But in terms of the ratios of colour I'm using, the amount of red and blue is absolutely minimal, but it's still important. So if you're having to do good colours, it's all about just getting a good balance between your colours on the palette. If the flesh needs to be that little bit warmer, well, you might need a tiny bit of red, but don't overdo it. You might need, if you add red, you always need to add a bit of ochre or yellow ochre or yellow to balance that red, because otherwise it will come up far too pink. And flesh is very rarely pink. I'm actually thickening the paint as I go as well. Just for the eyebrows just coming out a bit stronger. I'm just going to do the same with moustache. And if you want to put the paint on thickly, think of Vincent van Gogh and his self-portraits, really thick paint. You have to use the brush very delicately. If you push with the brush, you'll never get the paint thick. So you have to put virtually no pressure into your brush, and then you can build up thicker paint. In fact, more important than the darks I've just been putting in is the lighter areas of the flesh. You can use the paint thicker than the dark areas and really catch the light. So going back to the light here, now I'm putting on thicker paint yet again, thicker paint up the forehead here, thicker paint on the bridge of the nose. again, just putting the emphasis, bringing more emphasis onto those highlight areas.
Don't you think he needs a bit of a rest soon?
I think he does.
Mm.
Oh,
Yeah,
God,
we've been.
you know,
I mean, it's very difficult to sit still for so
Yeah.
long.
You've done
he's been a
brilliant.
fantastic model.
Very
sitting
good,
quietly for
excellent model.
Hours on end. Yes, have a stretch, Greg. I will
Have a cup of coffee. Do you
have
want
a cup of coffee.
Yeah, I'm going to need the loo